Hello, everyone. We're gonna give it just one more minute before we get started, but I hope you all have been good, having a good morning, noonish, evening, afternoon, whatever time it is, and whatever time zone you're at. So just bear with us 1 minute, and we'll get started soon. All right. Now will be a good of time as any to get started. So, welcome to today's application meetup on how to build a Angular application with application. And now that I'm just thinking about it, I don't know why we don't just call all apps applications now. Anyway, um, I guess I should give you all a little background about myself. Um, my name is Thank you, Max. My name is Michael Salati. I am a developer advocate at Application. And I've been in the realm of DevRel for roughly the past 3 to 4 years. My background before that, and even while doing DevRel, has been primarily as a front end developer. And I've been coding on the web for roughly 7 years now. And that's not me bragging, that's actually just me admitting to making mistakes for the past 7 years now. And I'm hoping that I can show you a thing or two so you don't have to bang your head against the keyboard like I have. So, thinking back on my experience as a developer, I can think of more than a few times where I had to build a full stack application for work. I can actually think of like two or three off the top of my head, and what that always meant is me brushing up on on Express because Express is awesome. Don't need to use it that often when I was working with like Angular or React. Setting up Mongo on my machine because MongoDB was the hot cool thing. I mean, it's still a good database, but that's just typically what we used at some of my uh, previous projects. And I have like little to no experience dealing with implementing authentication strategies. Like I'm familiar conceptually with things like Passport JS or I think it's Auth0. Um, and I know again conceptually how salting and hashing works and like what it is. But if any of you asked me to do this by scratch, I'd probably spend the next 2 hours here before just working on that before I would think that I'm done. And during that entire time, I think he'd be dropping comments pointing out all the mistakes I've made. Not necessarily the best experience. And honestly, it's a lot of wasted time that's going to be stressing me out before I even get started building any web application that's going to connect to this backend. It will drive me crazy. So, as a front end developer, I need a tool that would allow me to easily create data models, protect my data by requiring specific type of users to be able to touch my data, or basically like ACLs or access control lists. I want to handle authentication and user management, and to just be able to easily generate my REST endpoints or generate a GraphQL server for me. And that's where application comes in. So application generates production-ready, self-documenting GraphQL and REST APIs for all of your data models. The APIs are generated with authentication and authorization baked in. It also does all this using modern and trusted tools that you'll see used by massive tech companies. And that's tools like Nest.js, which is going to be the framework for building out these efficient and scalable Node.js server-side apps. Prisma to make it easy to run CRUD commands against your Postgres database, Apollo, so you can use GraphQL to write your CRUD commands, Swagger to visualize, document, and test your REST APIs, Passport.js to handle authentication securely, and TypeScript because honestly, it makes writing JavaScript a greater pleasure than just writing JavaScript. So you can quickly stub out your backend and download it right away to use. Building a project on, if you're building a project on GitHub, that's cool. Application can actually sync your application app to a GitHub repo by just opening a pull request against your repo. You can download your code, you can push it to GitHub, and at the end of the day, that means you own your code. So if you need to make changes to it, you can. You want to run it on GCP, AWS, Azure, or anywhere else, go for it. You're not locked in, which that's always a beautiful thing. So let's get started and get ready to build something cool. So give me 1 second. All right. So I have running locally a very simple application, which we're just going to get into it. My username and password here. I need this right now. And it just shows you a list of restaurants. There's a bunch of restaurants here. And if I want to, I can filter it by a certain type of cuisine. So I'll click the filter, get a bunch of different options. So we'll go with barbecue, click OK. This is all filtered. I can click on a restaurant. So we got AKA My House. Get some information about the place. If I want to leave a review, I can leave a review here. So we'll say food, like that. And the review will show up right here. And so something you may or may not have noticed, because I kind of just breezed right through this, is none of this data is quite right. Here's what I mean. Here's our list of restaurants. Let's say if I click on Mercury Tacos LLC. Well, I'm getting the information for $1.25 pizza. Let's say if I click the filter and I'll choose Afghan cuisine. Okay, AKA My House, AMC Lowe's, American Turner, New York. All right, that's fine. Let's switch to African. It's the same list of places. Let's switch to vegetarian. It's the same list of places. And there is a very simple reason for that. Let's look at some code. The reason for all this is just hard-coded data. So right now, this web application isn't actually connecting to any backend to dynamically fetch data or save data to the backend. It's just everything is local, which is here's a list of the restaurants. And that's why you see if I leave a review, pop, submit it, see the review here, refresh it, review's gone because it's not being saved anywhere. And so we're going to build a application backend to connect to this Angular application where we're going to be able to query data, query data, and store our data. So we're going to go to application.com. I'm going to go to login. And because I'm already logged in, I am greeted by this screen. But let's say if I sign out, I can just sign in with my GitHub account. There we go. And we're going to create a new application, new app. So you can actually start and have application build out a backend for you by just providing it like Excel or CSV, and it'll just take the schema of that and generate the backend. But we're going to start from scratch. And so we're going to build this backend for something that's going to be designed to allow me to kind of run a restaurant review application. So my first entity here is the user entity. This is basically like a table or a collection. And this is a auto-generated one, which is meant to handle authentication and manage users in the app. So let's add an entity or table or collection for restaurants. So we'll call it restaurant. If I spelled that wrong, because I think I did. Let's see. There we go. Let's create this. And here we are. And we can start to define what sort of fields that we expect a restaurant to have. So a restaurant should have a name. Okay, we'll add this name field. And I can see that I have these little different options for this name field that I want for a restaurant in the restaurant entity table collection. So for one, a name should definitely be required. So I want to enforce that. And yeah, it's just going to be a single line of text. I can set the maximum length. 1,000 is probably too long, but you know what? For the sake of this, probably fine. Another thing a restaurant would probably need is, let's think. I probably want an address. Let's add an address. And again, make this a required field. 1,000 characters for string is probably too much, but that's going to be fine for now. And you know what? That is probably okay for our restaurant. But another thing that we saw is we had cuisines. So let's create an entity for our cuisines. So we'll just add an entity. We'll call it cuisine. We'll create that entity. And again, every cuisine needs a name. That's where we saw like the Afghan, Armenian, American. So we'll just give it a field name. Again, required field. And next thing we're going to do is we're going to build a relationship between the different cuisines that we have and the restaurants that we have. Because a restaurant can serve cuisines of multiple foods. And this is kind of how we could filter restaurants based on cuisines. So, you know, we'll do this on the restaurant side of things. So back in our restaurant entity, we're going to add a field called cuisines. And all of a sudden, we're kind of being suggested that this is going to be a relation to our cuisine entity because, you know, we're kind of reusing the same name. So this is going to be a relation. This field on a restaurant object is going to be a relation to a cuisine. And so in this case, we have an option for one restaurant can be related to many cuisines, or when one restaurant can be, yes, I consume. Might be a little too much. Does this work? I'm going to assume this works until I get told otherwise. Okay. If I see otherwise, I'll zoom further, but give me a second. Okay. So in this case, we're going to say, yeah, a restaurant can have many cuisines. So we have the connection from restaurant to cuisine. It's a one-to-many relationship, and that is what we want. So that's awesome. And so if we now check the cuisine side of things, we can see cuisine now has a field called restaurant. And over here, we can see that, again, one cuisine can be related to many restaurants. So that relationship is bidirectional, and it's defined at the entity level. Another entity we're probably going to want to have. So we have our restaurants, we have our cuisines. We need a entity collection table for reviews. So let's add an entity for reviews. So we'll call this review. Create it. We'll have a field which is just the content. It's like if someone actually wrote the review or whatever they want. And instead of being a single line text, we can have this a multi-line text, and it will be required. And just to keep things simple, we'll just let people say if they like it or they don't like it. Yes, we could do something more complex like 0 to 5 stars, but for the sake of this application, it's just going to be like or dislike. So we'll add a like field. And so far, we've been kind of using text-based fields, and we just recently went into a relationship-based field. But for a like, this will be required, and we can actually set this as a Boolean field. And just to show you, there's a whole slew of different data types that can be used with application. So we're using some simple ones, but there's definitely a lot that you can use depending on what your application requires. What does a review need to have? Well, a review needs to be associated to a restaurant. So let's add a restaurant field. Again, it's auto-suggesting that this should be a relation to a different entity. So in this case, yeah, one review is going to be related to one restaurant. If I go to view the restaurant side of things, I now see reviews is here, and one restaurant can be related to many reviews. So yeah, a lot of different reviews can be for one restaurant, but a review should only have one restaurant. So that makes sense. And then the next thing that a review needs is it needs to belong to a user. So we'll add a user field. And again, it's suggesting an entity. So this is going to be a relation to the user entity, which is our user accounts. In this case, one review can be related to one user. Yep, that sounds right. And let's review our user entity. So we'll go into entities. We'll click user. I can see now users have this review. And here, one user could be related to many reviews. This all looks correct. So right off the bat, we've created a backend that has 4 tables, a table that's going to handle users and authentication, a table that will hold review information, a table that will hold restaurant information, and a table that will hold cuisine information. And we have, yes, well, it kind of adds it automatically. You have to use like the related name to the entity. Otherwise, it won't automatically make that suggestion. But it's not difficult to make that suggestion. And I'll show you real quick. Like, I'll just add a random field called pop. And it's not suggesting this to become a relation to another entity, but it's not difficult to make that relation. So in the data type area for that, relation to entity, select the entity that I want. And then I can just create that relation right here. So there is the auto suggestion, though you can easily add it yourself. So we'll just remove the pop for now. So yeah, we created the collection, we created the entities, we've built relations between them, we've set fields that we expect these elements in the entity to have. We set some of them to be required. And right off the side here, you can see that we haven't saved these changes yet. So changes that you make to your backend are actually version controlled. So we can theoretically always roll back changes that we don't want or see differences between changes. And this is actually more interesting and useful when you sync to GitHub. So you see here, there's this push code to GitHub, which if I was to use, I could create a pull request against a GitHub repo that I have. So we're just going to create our first commit changes and build. Down here, it says generating new build. I'm going to give this a second. And while that does that, I'm going to sip some coffee. Okay. So right off the bat, application is going to be building a sandbox environment. So if I wanted to test this live-ish on the web, I can test it in the sandbox. But in this case, I want to get the code right away. So I can actually download the code. So I'm going to click that. It's going to download. Give me a second. Okay. And this is my generated code that I just created. But I am not going to use this generated code because I actually have this project up and running, something very, very similar to this. So I am going to start to share some VS Code stuff, and we're going to get started from there. So where is VS Code? There we go. So this is what we had, and you can see these are a lot of the same files that was generated. So we have the admin UI, server, Docker ignore, env, amp config, etc., etc. And so I'm actually running the backend that was generated, that I've already generated here. And so because that's running, let's take a look at it. So it's going to be on localhost 3000, and we'll go to the GraphQL playground. All right, get rid of this. And so here's our GraphQL playground that was generated by application that I have running locally. And like I mentioned, things are self-documenting, so I can see what all my queries look like, as well as the schemas of the data objects that I have. So let's find one that I think would be interesting, and we have our cuisines query. So I can see what this looks like, cuisines, and I could see what sort of information I want. So let's write our query here to test it. So it'll be cuisines. Spell it. Cuisines. And okay, so cuisines have a few different properties. So cuisines will have an ID, they'll have a name, and they'll have a restaurant. And they'll have an array of restaurants associated to them because we've built that relation between restaurants and cuisines. So for our restaurants, let's get a list of the names that belong to the restaurants because a restaurant element has the name field. So I should be able to just run this. Unauthenticated requests. That is fine. Give me 1 second. I need to get a auth token, which means I need to sign in, and I'm going to try to do this quickly. So mutation, login. That looks right. And I think that's right. So run that. Okay, here's the access token I need. We'll set that in my headers. Okay, that's set. Let's undo this to get the cuisines query. And now we should be able to run that. And boom, here we go. Here's our list of cuisines from our application backend. So I see the name, bakery, and here's a list of bakeries or restaurants associated to that. And I can keep scrolling. There's probably too many bakeries. I actually probably skipped the next thing. But you get the idea. This is us like right away using the application backend. You can see that authorization comes out the box. I didn't have to do any configuration with that. And I was able to write my login mutation right away, use it to get my token, and then start making queries against my backend. So this is working right now. And I actually pre-populated the database with information like the cuisines, the restaurants, etc. So let's get started by linking this application to the backend. And the first thing we're going to need to do, let's just clear the data. The first thing we're going to need to do is we're going to have to create 2 endpoints in our application backend. Right now, we auto-generate a login endpoint, but we're going to want to create an endpoint that's going to handle sign up as well as just getting information about the user. So let's open up VS Code. Let's go to the code generated by the server backend. Give me 1 second. Just got to move some screens. Okay. Okay. Let's go server and server. We're going to go into source. Auth. And let's go into our auth service here. And so our auth service is like the entry point for both our GraphQL and REST API requests to be able to handle authentication. So here we see this is our login method, which will handle login for us. And so I am just going to kind of add a signup function. So we have login, and let's create a signup. So this is going to be, it's actually, you know what? I could just copy this login code for signup because it's going to be very similar. So we'll switch this to signup. We do not need to validate the user. but we do want to make sure that we have their credentials. And so what we'll do here is, instead of validating the user, we're going to create a new user. And that's going to be with the user service. So this dot user service create. We're going to add our data field. So we're going to make sure that we give our user a username, a password, and we're going to actually add a role. Roles are kind of how we protect certain types of how we protect our entities, such that only certain types of users are able to access or modify that data. So we have a role called reviewer, which is going to be for people who are leaving reviews. Yeah. So once the code is generated for you, you can just build on top of it. And what is actually kind of nice about this is, like, I can just make my modifications to the code as needed. And if I'm syncing this to GitHub, let's say if I make a change on application, GitHub will open the pull request, and I can just merge those changes on top of the changes that I've made in application, on top of the changes I've made locally to my code. Hopefully that answers that question. Okay, so that is one thing. Okay, so this is how we can create a new user with a role. We grab the access token from the user. And here we're just gonna, instead of returning the entire user object, we will just do username, which will be the user username. And then roles will be the user roles. Okay, so now we've created the logic to allow a user to sign up. There's one predefined role, which is the user role, but let me see if I can show you real quick. But you can create a list of different roles in the application backend, so you can create whatever you want. And then let's say if we go to the entities, actually, let me add another role here. So we'll add the reviewer here. So now we have two roles. One is user, one is reviewer. If I go to entity, let's say I go to cuisine, I can set permissions. And so right now, any role has access to cuisines, but I can set it such that only reviewers have access to cuisines. So hopefully that answers your question, Christian. Let's just jump back to this real quick. So here's our way to sign up a user. And I am actually just going to throw in some code I've written ahead of time on how to grab a user information. Give me 1 second to just make a couple more tweaks. It's going to be in regards to the imports. Okay. So this is going to be for an endpoint that I'm going to have called me, which will take the bearer token or the authorization token and just grab the user information and return that user information based on the JWT access token. The only other thing I need to do is make a modification to the token service such that I can decode the bearer token. So I'm just going to add that code here. Boom, boom. And so now our auth service has a method for logging in, a method for signing up, and a method for getting the current user. So this is awesome. I just need to set it such that my GraphQL API can actually access these functions. So to make modifications to our GraphQL stuff, we do that in the resolver. So we'll go to the auth resolver. And let's add the mutation for signing up and the query for me. Just a few changes in my imports I need to make. There we go. So here we have our sign up, which takes the authentication or the login args, because the logins just look for username and password. So we're going to use that for sign up, and then we generate a user account and return that. And for me, we are also going to return the user information. So it's a query, returns user, but it requires the headers from the requests, specifically the authorization header from the request, because that's where the bearer token is going to be stored. So in the as the argument for the me method, we are just getting the request, and then we're calling the auth service me function, where we're passing in the request headers and then specifically the authorization token. Kind of breeze by that. I will come back to this later if needed, but just trust me for now that this works. We're going to save that, and I'm going to rerun the server and take a sip of coffee. And let's go back to our playground, and let's refresh this. And if I go into the docs, you could see, and you might not have seen this before because this wasn't there before, we now have our query for the me, which will return our user information. And we also now have a mutation for signing up, which returns like the access token, users roles, and user's name. So this is awesome. We can work from this. Let's hook this up to our front end application. So let us jump into it. So I kind of showed you what the client application looks like, which is the Angular application. And in order to access our application backend, we are going to be using Apollo. Apollo is a GraphQL client that is created by the Apollo team or the Meteor team. I don't know how the relationship between those entities work, but it is probably one of the most reliable and used GraphQL client libraries. And because we're going to be doing this in Angular, we're specifically going to be using a community maintained version of Apollo called Apollo Angular. And getting configured with Apollo Angular is super, super easy because you don't have to do npm install and then do importing the required modules or services into your application. There's actually a schematic that the Apollo Angular has. So we can just do ng add Apollo Angular, and it will configure virtually everything we need right from the get-go for us. So I'm just going to copy that, go back into, wrong one, go back into the client application. Nope, I just clicked the same thing. Okay, here we go. Go back into the client application. Also not what I wanted. Okay, here we go. And we're just going to paste in ng add Apollo Angular. I will click enter, and it's going to do a couple of things for me. So would I like to proceed with installing Apollo Angular 3.01? Yes. It will install our packages for us. What's the URL to our GraphQL API endpoint? That's going to be HTTP. You know, I'm just going to copy it because I'm willing to bet I'm going to make a mistake. Here we go. Wrong one still. Okay, here we go. All right, localhost 3000 GraphQL. Version of GraphQL 16. That sounds good. That is fine. That is fine because I actually already set these things up ahead of time in the tsconfig. Otherwise, it would have done this for me automatically. But what it does is it creates a GraphQL module. It installs the dependencies for Apollo Angular, which if you look at this, the dependencies are Apollo Angular and GraphQL. It adds the GraphQL module to our app module imports. So it does all the configuration for us. And if you look at it, it's already pointing to our the correct backend, which is our localhost 3000. So like 2-3 lines of things I actually had to type. One is add Apollo Angular, and 2 was the endpoint, and then my GraphQL module is configured and loaded into my application. The only thing I'm going to make a change here, though, this is all fine and dandy, is right now it is not using the bearer token for authentication. And so what I want to do is set this up such that any request made with my GraphQL module is just automatically going to use the bearer token. So I'm going to just copy a little bit of code that I have pre-written and paste that here. And that's going to kind of help set things up. So I need set context, environment, this, that. Boom, boom. All right. So I'm going to add this kind of function here, which is going to take the JWT token. And it's just going to add it as the bearer token for requests that require for my request as a header, specifically the authorization header. And so this function I'm going to need to add. And so we're just going to have to modify this HTTP link part. So let's just copy that for now. We're going to do the auth link, cat. So we're going to merge these things. We're going to add the HTTP link, save that. And so now all of our requests will, if there is a JWT access token, it's going to add the access token to handle authorization for us. Okay. So now we have our GraphQL modules configured, and so we can actually get started with handling login. So let's go into our services, and I have an auth service pre-written. Right now, it is very simple. It is not really doing anything, though there's a method for login, which is taking the username and password, a method for sign up, which is taking the username and password. And I'm going to want to get started with stubbing out these services such that we're actually using the application. So I'm gonna start with writing a simple query just to show like how this would work in a regular process, and then we'll go from there. So for example, we created our me query. So let's try it. So we'll do query me. We're gonna use me, and the me object, I believe, just stores our ID. Or what else do we have? Username, and I think that's it. All right, so let's run the query me. And we can see that the query me works such that I'm getting my ID and my username. And this is the query that I need. So let's add this to the application. I'm going to move this out of here so I stop clicking it accidentally. There we go. So what are we going to need? We are going to need to import two things from our Apollo Angular library. Apollo Angular. So the first thing we're going to need is the Apollo service and GQL, which GQL allows us to write our queries and mutations. So let's write our query, which is to get me GQL. And what I can do here is I'm just going to copy the query that I have in the query that I just tested here. And I'm going to just paste that query here. And so there is my get me query. And I can do the same thing for our login, because I think this should exist still. It was deleted. Okay. But earlier I used a login mutation, which looked something kind of like this, if that looks familiar. So I have the get me query, and I'm just going to add a mutation for logging in as well as signing up. And they both look very similar. And the only thing that I'm looking for in both of these mutations is just to get the access token so I can save it. And I can use the access token to make authenticated requests. So let's get started in here in the actual authentication service. And we'll start by injecting our Apollo. And let's actually start using this. So let's see how we would write a query. And we'll start with the me bit, or the me query. So we'll do this dot Apollo. We're going to want to make a query. And our query is going to be the get me that I wrote before. Now, ignoring the errors for now, we will fix this in a second. This is going to return a observable. If you've worked with Angular before, you should be familiar with RxJS and observables, which are these continuous data streams. They're similar in concept to promises, but whereas a promise will only trigger once, observables can resolve multiple times. And I'm definitely underselling what an observable is, but I think that's a simple enough way to grasp it if you're not familiar with what our observables are. Yes, I believe this is going to be live on our YouTube channel. So what we're going to do is we're going to take the observable, and before a user subscribes to, or before the application subscribes to the observable, or conceptually it's like before a user calls then on a promise, we're going to pipe the data coming from this observable through a couple of functions. So I'm going to call pipe, and what this pipe allows us to do is to make modifications to our allows us to make modifications to the data before it gets to whatever component is going to be calling or using the data. So our first pipe is going to be, we're going to handle errors. So we'll do a catch error. And so if this function errors, we're still going to resolve it. We're going to suppress the error, but we're just going to return null. Reason for that is we can avoid the error headaches, and on the client side, if this is returning nothing, we can handle it from there. Next thing I'm going to want to do, make sure this is right, is we're going to add a map. And what the map does, it allows us to modify the data on success. So because we're catching the error, we're suppressing the error, it's going to be considered a success. But we're only looking if data exists inside of the request. So what is wrong here? That is right. Give me 1 second. Okay. Okay, yeah, so what we're looking for is a data field, and if the data field exists, it's going to return a me. This looks a lot neater now that I've finished it. So we make the query, and then we take the data from the result from the query before it's used by the user or the application, and we make a couple of modifications. If the query failed or there was an error, we're just going to return nothing, null. And because after that point, it's always considered a success, we're going to return the me field, but we only return the me field if it exists on the data object. Hence this Elvis operator. I think it's called the Elvis operator here, which is kind of just like an optional bit. So if the user exists, we'll return the user data, which is what you see here. But if the data doesn't exist, then it's just going to return null anyway. And so this is how we'll handle getting the user object. And I'll show you how that kind of looks like for a mutation as well. So mutation is when we write data basically to our backend. So let's write a mutation, and we'll write the mutation for the login. So this _Apollo, definitely taking longer than the 30 minutes, but I'm going to try to make this reasonably fast. Login. So that's the mutation we're going to use, which is our login that we created up here or defined up here. And login requires a couple of variables. So for the variables for this, it requires the credentials, which is going to be the username and password. Okay. Then I'm just going to copy some pipes here. Okay. So we're going to Apollo, we're writing a mutation, which is our login, we're passing the credentials, and we're running pipes again. So if it errors, we're returning nothing. Then this merge map works very similar to the map, but if you're more interested in ArcsJS, I invite you to take a look into this. But what we're going to do is we're going to see if the login field exists in the data object. If it doesn't exist, then it probably errored. And so we're just going to return an empty object, and we'll throw an error message saying couldn't log in. Otherwise, we'll take the access token, which belongs to the login object, we'll store it, and then we'll call the me method, which returns the current user object. And I'm just going to basically do the same thing for our signup. So let's save that. Give me 1 second. And let's go to our client application, and we'll test this to make sure this works. So we'll give this a refresh. Here we go. And let's see if our sign in, sign up stuff works. So network GraphQL. Okay. So let's say we need an account. User, promise you that password is secure. Submit that. And we can see here that our GraphQL, we can start to see these GraphQL requests, which is this first one is to signing up a user. And we can see the result, which is the access token, which we save. And then the next request is against the me method, which gets the user information for us. So right off the bat, we're starting to use kind of live data for our, honestly, I don't know why the Apollo, I have an Apollo plugin here, Chrome extension, and I don't know why that's not working, but that's fine for now. So right now we're actually using our backend to handle authentication. So let's build it such that this data here for the restaurants is actually using live restaurant information instead of this like hard-coded restaurant data. So let's open up our auth service. Let's go to restaurants actually. And we're going to want to write our two queries for restaurants. Yes, you can also use REST API endpoints instead of GraphQL ones. Right now, I've just been working in the GraphQL playground, so that's localhost 3000 GraphQL, and this is on our. This is running off of the application server, but if I go to localhost 3000 API, here's like our Swagger UI, so we can see all the endpoints, and we can actually test our endpoints right here. So yes, you can use REST. You don't have to use GraphQL. Hold on. Aaron, if I make changes via application, after making custom code changes, adding new fields, roles, will those changes be merged into an existing code base? That is a good question. Yes and no. The changes right now are created as a pull request, so you may have to make a couple of changes because there may be an overwrite. Though if you look at our roadmap, we are currently working on a GitHub sync, so we can keep our version of the changes you make up to date so that we don't accidentally overwrite stuff in the pull request. So right now it's not perfect, but it is getting a lot better, and I know that's a work in progress that the engineers are actively working on. So I don't know the timeline for that, but for yes, it's right now it's a little iffy, but in the future it's going to get really, really good. Hopefully that answers that question. All right, so let's actually start to use live restaurant data now. So in this case, again, for our restaurants, we're going to need to use Apollo Angular. So we're going to want the GQL and Apollo. And we're gonna use two different queries here. They might look a little long, but I can break them down. So here's our two queries. One is get restaurant, which gets an individual restaurant. The other one is get restaurants, which returns a list of restaurants. So for restaurants, there's a few arguments. There's take, order by, and where. The take kind of says it's kind of like a limit to how many restaurants I want to return. Order by allows me to sort based on a field. So in this case, for take, I'm going to set it so I'm only returning 100 restaurants. Order by is going to be, so I'm sorting it by name such that we're going in alphabetical order. So it goes like 0 to 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 8, A, B, C, all the way to Z. And where is a condition because the data I have is bad and some of the restaurants that I have no name. It's like just an empty string. So I'm going to be filtering those out with the where for that to make sense. Hopefully that does. And so what's going to be returned is a list of restaurants where I just have their ID and their name. This here is a query to get an individual restaurant. So we get an individual restaurant based on the ID. That's our where. We are going to return the ID, the address, information, the cuisines associated to the restaurant, the name of the restaurant. And we're also going to take the reviews. So we're going to grab the reviews. We're probably just going to grab like 100 reviews, and we're going to display that here. And for the reviews, we need to know if the user liked it, what the review was, etc., etc. I'm breezing by it because I'm taking more than the 30 minutes, and I want to stay somewhat close to being timely. So let's actually use these queries over here. So we'll do private hello. And let's start with our all restaurants. So it's going to be return this hello. Make a query. Our query is going to be the restaurants. So this is going to fetch all the restaurants. The query has a couple of variables. Take argument is going to be, we're just going to take the first 100 restaurants. We're going to order this by the name field, and we're going to do this in ascending order. And we are going to make sure that we are not grabbing restaurants where the name is a empty field. So where not empty. That is that. And we're just going to pipe the data. So these are the modifications that are being made to the data before it's actually used by the application. So our first is the catch error. So if it does error, that means nothing is coming through, and we're just going to have it return an empty array. Otherwise, we'll just make a modification to the data. So that we are getting the restaurant's information. And I'm realizing a minor mistake here. Data. Restaurants. Okay. So that's what our query should look like. So this is going to fetch all those restaurants we have. I'm going to save this and show you guys what this looks like. So over here, if I refresh this, this should be, yay, the Apollo thing is showing up. This should be our list of live restaurants right now. And there's about 100 of these that should be showing up. So let's limit this so that we're only showing 10 restaurants. And so you can see that this query is actually going against the backend instead of just local data that I have. So I switch this to 10. And now I can't really scroll. Here's our 10 restaurants here. I'm just gonna, we're gonna update our get one. So I'm just gonna copy the code, make this simple, and I'll just run through what this does real quick. So this is our query to get one restaurant. So Apollo query, our query is get restaurant, which is just the one restaurant. The variables is the where condition is the ID of the restaurant. So I want to make sure I'm grabbing just that one restaurant. For reviews, I'm going to take 100 reviews, and I'm going to order the reviews by the date that they were created. And then we have a similar thing with this catch error, null, etc., etc. Save that. And so now, if I go into a restaurant, I can actually click on one of these restaurants, and the information I should get is relevant to the restaurant. So we'll do 1001 Nights. Click that. And all of a sudden, the information here is actually for 1001 Nights because I'm making a query specifically for that restaurant. I am definitely going over on time. So I am going to speed through the cuisines and the reviews. Just so I'm being somewhat respectful of everyone's time here. So let's get started with the cuisines. And we'll do this real quick. We'll manage the cuisines real quick. So in the cuisine service, again, we're going to need Apollo and Angular. Apollo and GQL. Private Apollo, and I will just copy our queries over here. So here's our get cuisine, where we get a unique cuisine. We get the restaurants for the cuisine. We order the restaurants by alphabetical order, and we're also doing the same check where we're making sure the restaurant's name isn't empty. So basically what this is when we do when we get all the cuisines, or when we get an individual cuisine, we're going to get the individual cuisine's ID, their name, and all the restaurants associated to that cuisine. And all those restaurants is going to have a similar filter to the restaurants query. So that's what this is going to look like. And then for getting all the cuisines, we are just going to put it in alphabetical order, and we're just going to grab the ID and the name of that restaurant. Name and ID of that cuisine. So for our all method, get cuisines and order them by name, and we've just run this little catch for the errors. For getting a individual cuisine, get the individual cuisine based on the ID. We only take 100 restaurants associated to that cuisine. We sort them in ascending order by name, and making sure that the name is not empty. And the reason that this works is in the home component, I have this filter method. So when you select a cuisine, I'm going to filter it based on the ID. And so if you select a cuisine, I assign the restaurants array to the result of making that query on the cuisine. Otherwise, in that cuisine, we'll have the restaurants associated to it. Otherwise, I'm just going to list all the restaurants. So now, if we do Asian food, it's a unique list of restaurants based on that are Asian restaurants. If I switch to seafood, it's going to be a unique list of restaurants that are based that are seafood places. And if I select all, instead of making a query against cuisines, it's going to make a query against restaurants. And here's all of the restaurants. And the last thing we need to do for this application to really be done is allow users to write reviews and to save those reviews. So we'll go into our review service. Again, we need Apollo and GQL. Let's add Apollo to our constructor as a dependency. And here is okay, well, I managed to not even know what okay, I don't know why that worked. That worked. All right, so we'll drop our review here. So we create a review, we pass the data in for the review, and we're going to return a bunch of information on the review, such as like what restaurant the review belongs to, if the user liked it, information on the user so we can display that information. And so we'll just update this create review to actually be using GraphQL. And this is a bit of a longer function, but I will be sharing this code later. So you guys can definitely take a look at it later. Okay, let's save that. All right, and let's go to a restaurant. We'll go to $1.25 pizza. Let's leave a review. Say great. I can spell great. Great pizza. Submit that review. The review shows up, which we saw that happen before. But I'm just going to pop right here in the Apollo plug extension, and we can see that a mutation was actually written. And we can see the information on the mutation, what it looked like. So now that I know this review has actually been saved to the backend, I can refresh it. And the review is still there. It is persisting. Why? Because it's actually being saved to the backend. I know I rushed through a bunch of this stuff right here, but if you're interested in actually getting a deeper dive on using GraphQL with Angular or using application with your for your Angular application, I want to say about an hour and a half ago launched our Angular application tutorial. So I'm just going to leave this URL up for a second. I'm just going to take a sip of coffee. So I invite you guys to visit this URL. We have a full to-do list tutorial, which goes over some of the things we did in this application. Like it'll go over building the application. I will answer your question in a second. I'm going to ask you to re-ask that question in a second. Sorry, I saw it, but I want to finish my train of thought here for 1 second. This tutorial will go over building a application using the application UI. It goes over downloading it. It goes over adding the custom endpoints. So like the sign up method as well as the me method. It goes into a deeper dive on how those work and so how you can extend what application provides to you. It'll go over adding Apollo Angular to your Angular application. It goes over implementing login and the me function with both GraphQL and REST endpoints. It goes over making mutations into your application backend. So like I invite you guys to visit this for a full tutorial. And the code for today's presentation is going to be made available probably in the next day or so. So if you're not a member of our Discord, I invite you guys to join our Discord. If you go to application.com, right up here, there's a join Discord, so you can join our community. And this is going to be shared there as well, the code base for this. So I invite you guys to check this all out. And I think we're good to go into questions. And I saw one question. Let me see. Thank you. Yes, it was asked again, or it got popped up again. Since we both use REST API and GraphQL, which one should we choose? Is there any advantage to choosing GraphQL over REST API? I think it's a bit of a preference thing. I do kind of like the auto generation with GraphQL because I think it's easier to make certain types of requests. Specifically, like when it comes to filtering fields that you want, it's a lot easier to declare the fields that you want to see, which I think is really good because in the case where we were getting all the restaurants, if I just get all restaurants with the REST thing, I'm going to get a ton of fields that I don't need. So like when I was, on this field, the only information I need is the restaurant name and the ID of the restaurant. And if I made that on the REST API, I will get the restaurant name, the restaurant ID, restaurant address, just a bunch of additional fields. I could filter them, but with GraphQL, it's much easier to write that query so those fields are filtered. For me, I kind of like GraphQL because it gives me more fine control over what fields I request, which then means my requests to the database are smaller. Like the data being sent back, like the JSON object is going to be a smaller object. So ideally, my requests will be faster because I'm just sending less data through the wire. It's completely up to you, depending on the application. If it's a simple application, I think REST API makes perfect sense. Like GraphQL is kind of a lot if you're just making one or two HTTP REST requests, but for larger applications, I think GraphQL makes more sense. But again, completely up to you. I mean, we're going to provide both to you anyway, so You're not going to lose anything. Let's see if there was anything else I missed. I don't know if there. Okay. Yeah, of course. I want to pronounce your name. The only thing I understand there is GFX Argentina. Maybe I'm saying that correctly. But join the Discord so you can connect with us. And if you have any questions, I will definitely be able to answer them there. Yep. Okay. I see. I'm looking at some of the older questions. I think this is from, and I apologize if I butcher your name, Johan. Why is something like sign up not automatically generated as well? So right now, all the endpoints are that we generate are protected, requiring authentication. So there is actually a post for a user, which will allow you to create the user, but this requires you to actually be authenticated for now, which is a little bit of an inconvenience. So we're creating our own endpoint where you don't need to be authenticated in order to create the user. This is changing. One of the things on the roadmap that's being worked on now is preventing certain that you can choose which endpoints require authentication. And when that lands, then you'd be able to do this on your own. But for the time being, all the endpoints except login are authenticated by default. So I just had to, for this sake, I just created a an endpoint that allowed you to create a user without requiring authentication. Otherwise, something that the application tool provides is actually a admin UI. So this is running on localhost 3001. That if I wanted to, I could just create a user here, which I think is kind of how things would work if you didn't have an exposed endpoint. But you'd be able to create the user and assign the roles here. Hopefully that answers that question. I'm just going to scroll through and see if I missed anything else. Okay, I think it's Sachin. I learned that application is very handy to developers. Yay! If we already have beginner intermediate knowledge of TypeScript, that's not. You can use it without requiring a deep knowledge of TypeScript, right? Like we'll generate a lot of the code for you, and you only need to know TypeScript if you want to extend on what's provided. But the beautiful thing about TypeScript is that it is just a superset of JavaScript. So anything and everything you know how to write in JavaScript, you can write on TypeScript with little to no problems. TypeScript just adds a level of protection and sanity checks by providing types to the data objects that you're working with, so that you won't accidentally confuse a number with a string, or if you're working with an object, you know what properties belong to the object. So I don't know how deep of a knowledge of TypeScript you need to have. I think that varies from developer to developer, but I would say that you should at least explore it, because if you have some background with JavaScript, TypeScript is just a superset of JavaScript. It's built on top of it. It should look fairly familiar. And if you know how to write JavaScript, you know how to write TypeScript. I guess that's what I have to say for that. Just scrolling through. That one was answered. Most confusing thing in Angular is observables. At first, it could be, but they are ridiculously powerful in the sense that it kind of allows you to manage your state, because you can trigger the UI changes based on changes to the observable. And using observables in the UI is not too difficult. If you're not familiar with using observables in the UI, I think I have a place where I do that. Give me a second to find it. Where is it? I think it's for the cuisines dropdown or filter. So, okay, so right here, so in that filter that where is it? So for this filter right here that you see, that's this component here, where on construction of when the component is initialized, we just grab all the cuisines and we assign it to cuisines, and it's an observable, which is an array of cuisines. And instead of subscribing to it or like doing anything like that, because it's a straight array, just right in the UI, I'm just iterating over the cuisines. So the only thing I do is pipe cuisines through this async pipe. And so now this ng4 is treating the cuisines like a regular array. It's subscribing to the array, it's getting the result, and when the component is destroyed, it will automatically unsubscribe from cuisines. So you can see like cuisine.name, I'm not doing anything to subscribe to this data other than just piping it through async. I would recommend getting familiar with observables in RxJS. If I add custom code and go back to application to generate more code or modify an entity, will my custom code be overwritten? I might be misrepresenting this, and this is a question that I invite us to continue on Discord. I will say it depends on what changes you make, though. Give me 1 second. I'm just going to our roadmap just to make sure I'm giving you this information correctly. Okay, so this is public information that you guys can see. So I think right now some things may potentially be overwritten, but we are working on GitHub sync so that like your code should not be overwritten, because we'll handle git diffs before before the changes are pushed up and stuff like that. Anyway, yeah, sorry, I've definitely gone over a little bit on time, and I apologize for that. I think that should be good for now. Hold on 1 second. We've definitely gone over, so I think we'll call it here. For the roadmap, to see what features are coming down the road, if you go to docs.application.com and search for roadmap, you'll get to our roadmap information. So I invite you guys to check that out to see what's coming down the road. And join our Discord. The URL will probably be added to the description of this video, or if you just go to the application website, join the Discord so you can view our community, ask questions there. And I think that's it for now, guys. Thank you for joining this speed run of building a application, and looking forward to seeing you guys in the Discord.